Hello and welcome back to Rock Review. Today we're going to address a very controversial subject. There were a large number of double albums which were released in the 70s and 80s, which have gone on to be revered as classics. However, there's a school of thought that says, hang on a minute, should these albums actually have been single albums? Would they be much better had the band decided to wield the scissors and cut them back so that they fitted roughly 36 to 40 minutes of sound? If you look at the greatest albums of all time, we're talking about things like Dark Side of the Moon and Led Zeppelin 4, we're seeing albums that have a running length of around 36 minutes. And that seems to be a universal measure of almost how much creativity a group can deliver at the highest level in a recording session or a series of recording sessions. So we're going to look at some of those albums which at the time, many were monster hits. But in retrospect, after the passage of time, we can have a little look and say, really, was there enough material to justify a double album? Would they have been better to either never have released some of this material or to wait for the next album? The first album is Led Zeppelin's Physical Graffiti. This album was enormously well received when it was released back in 1974. It went to number one in America, it went to number one in the UK, and I think probably number one on just about everywhere else on the planet. It does, of course, have the all-time classic Kashmir, which is up there with Led Zeppelin. But it's a strange genesis for this album because there are a lot of songs that were worked on for earlier sessions, either for Houses of the Holy or indeed Led Zeppelin 4, and were rejected at the time or were felt they were not quite ready for the album. There's also this strange thing like In My Time of Dying, a Bob Dylan song. Was that really necessary? Is that one that people who love Led Zeppelin seek out and go and listen to? Again, the album begins to slow down somewhat on side 4 when we have this miscellany of various tracks like Boogie with Stu and so forth. From my opinion, had the scissors been wielded, had they started with great tracks like The Rover, Kashmir and In the Light, I think it could have been an all-time classic album as a single album. Not to say it hasn't become a classic album, it has. But from my opinion, for what it's worth, and I think there are quite a few people out there who share this opinion, it would have been far better cut back to one album. The next album we're going to talk about is The Lamb Lies Down on Broadway. This was the last recording by Peter Gabriel with Genesis. It's a revered album in many respects. It's one of these records that's considered to be almost beyond criticism. But for me, I would have loved to have heard this record as a single album. I mean, Silent Sorrow and Empty Boats, or whatever it's called, I don't think it's a track that people search out, Genesis fans, to hear. And the material just falls short of being able to hold your attention for 4 sides of a record. I don't think there are many, and I am a serious Genesis fan, I don't think there are many of us out there who go and find this album again in order to listen to all 4 sides sequentially. I think it was a bridge too far in many respects. Some tremendous tracks on there, In the Cage and Carpet Crawlers, are wonderful compositions, brilliantly realised. However, there are not quite enough of them to justify the epic length of this record, in my opinion. The next record is, of course, Works, the Emerson, Lake and Palmer album, which was very well received at the time and became a huge hit. It does, of course, have fanfare for the common man and Pirates. Those two tracks alone would have made this a great single album, but as you know, we have a piano concerto. I don't know how many of us go and listen to that these days. It was too much of an indulgence, and the material was just too thin. It couldn't stretch to cover 4 sides of vinyl. And we do have indulgence where Carol Palmer becomes a composer as well as a percussionist. And it's just too much. The album is not one that people return to. And it's a great shame, because I think had it been a more closely edited version of Fanfare, and had we seen that running into Pirates, I think you would have a side of vinyl which was almost as good as Tarkus or anything they did. But because it was so sprawling and so laid out, it begins to lose its impetus, and we do end up with the weaker material dragging everything down. The next album is one which at the time, in order to afford records, I used to deliver newspapers. So you can imagine how disappointed I was when I got a copy of Tales from Topographic Oceans. This is an album bursting with ideas, but it's a double album. And the fact that the band is allowed to stretch out endlessly, it would appear, the album loses its impact and loses its muscle, and very quickly degenerates, for me, into an album that I never really reach for these days. Coming hard on the heels of Close to the Edge, I think we all expected something very special. Unfortunately, Bill Bruford had left the fold, and Alan White was a fantastic replacement, but something had changed, and the result is a meandering album where there are great ideas, but we see Rick Wakeman, for example, seems to vanish into the background. He becomes someone who appears to be indifferent to the album. So there are 4 sides and 4 compositions. If those 4 compositions had been edited, if someone had looked at it at the time and said, we can make a world-class 40 minutes of music, they would have done. Tales from Topographic Oceans is an album which is often cited as a great work, and it is a great work, but it could have been an even better work with some judicious editing. The next album is probably lesser known than the others. This is Focus 3. This album could have been a fantastic single album. People probably don't enjoy it as much as they could because of the sprawling, extended nature of some of the compositions on there that really are only on the album because there's the room to put them on the album. I think a hard-nosed producer taking a look at that would say, actually, what we have created here, guys, is a wonderful single album. By extending it mercilessly, as they did do, Focus 3 is one of the most disappointing double albums. And I think it actually has the effect of chasing people away from Focus. It's got the hits on there, but when you pick it up and listen to the compositions that just are extended beyond their natural life, it becomes, in retrospect, a very, very disappointing record that could have been a milestone of rock music. The other guy that we need to consider here is Frank Zappa. Frank was inclined to bring out a lot of records. I think there's about 60 at least albums that he released. But I remember at the time buying Shake Your Booty in Joe's Garage and enjoying the albums very much. But when we had Joe's Garage Acts 1, 2 and 3, again, ideas that were pretty thin were stretched over 3 sides of vinyl. At the time, I remember thinking Watermelon and Easter Hay was one of his best ever performances, and I think his son rates it as his best ever guitar solo. So once again, there were this tremendous material that would have made a sublime record. But by putting it in the company of lesser material and extending the thing over 4 sides of value, it loses its appeal and it loses its charm. So I think there are 2 entries from Frank. Shake Your Booty could have been an all-time classic. Joe's Garage could have been an all-time classic. But I think both fail the test because there's too much extraneous material. Think of those as single albums, the best of those 2 put together. It's a record you would reach for time and time again. I don't reach for Joe's Garage, Acts 1, 2 and 3 time and time again. Probably for that reason. There's too much filler. There's too much material that otherwise wouldn't make it to vinyl. As I always say, I think Dark Side of the Moon is a yardstick for progressive music. It's brilliantly realised and it's relatively short. It's 36 minutes running length, and that's really all that you need in a side of vinyl. You're on 2 sides of vinyl. That's really all you need in 2 sides of vinyl. You're hearing the best of what the artist has to offer at that time. The problem with double albums is you sometimes hear not always the best that the artist has to offer. You get the second and sometimes third-rate tracks because there's the room to put them on vinyl. And I think that's a great shame. So Pink Floyd have achieved the world masterpiece, which is Dark Side of the Moon. They also gave us Uma Guma, which is not the best album you could ever reach for. Again, this suffers from the fact that there could have been quite an interesting live album there, but we end up with 4 sprawling sides of vinyl where each member feels it's time that they showed us just how clever they are. And that doesn't always work, and it certainly doesn't work on Uma Guma. The ideas just aren't there to justify 4 sides of volume. It's one of these albums that people tend to have in their collection, but I wonder just how often a Pink Floyd fan actually says, I'm not going to listen to Meddle, or I'm not going to listen to Atom Heart Mother, I'm going to put on Uma Guma. I don't think that happens too often. The reason is there's some great live performance and some interesting studio performances, I would say, but that's about it as far as we go. So this is another album that could have been an interesting single album, but frankly is a disaster as a double album. The next one is an album which I really enjoy, Mike Oldfield's Incantations, which I think is a classic example of an idea that's stretched too thinly. Again, I don't think there are many Mike Oldfield fans out there who are reaching for Incantations and listening to all 4 sides in a single sitting. I certainly don't. I love the melodies, I love the creation of this album, but 4 sides was just far too much. It should have been a great single album. The next album is a very controversial choice because this was the Beatles' famous White Album, released in November 1968. This was the first recording after Sgt. Pepper, which for many people was a landmark in their recording career. This, to me, epitomizes the problem of double albums. There is a genius single album here that would be sublime to listen to, and I think would be an all-time universal favourite. However, what the band decided, there was a lot of material, let's make it a double album. It's always the danger, because the tracks that creep into a double album, many would never have made the cut had there been the discipline there and the producer saying, no, we've got 36 minutes or 40 minutes of vinyl to fill, and we're not going to record anymore. We're going to focus on the 40 minutes. So you get these rambling sessions where crazy things begin to make it onto an album. I'm sure there are very few, even of the most die-hard Beatles fans, who go out and say, I think I'll just put on tonight Revolution number 9 and enjoy that. To be honest, it's a debacle. It doesn't work. It's only on this album because there's the room to put it on the album. And for me, that detracts from the amazing quality of the tracks that have gone before. This is an album that would really have benefited from a strong producer who would have had the wisdom to decide which of these tracks are going to make a world-beating album. Not just a great album, but a world-beating album. And sometimes the discipline of actually editing back what you've done, cutting out some of the nonsense, and being prepared to say, that's not going on this record, will produce a great album, a truly great album. So that's it for this little roundup. Thank you very much for joining us. If you've enjoyed the debate, please keep coming back to the channel. Please subscribe. The whole point of this is to bring together people like us who are passionate about classic rock music and make it a collective. So please remember, subscribe for the channel, comment on the channel, and please join us next time.